main elements of the briefing.
Great, thanks, Andrew, and good afternoon, everybody. So, as Andrew said, I shall run you through the headlines of the report. Obviously, the full briefing is on the website, and you can play around with the data there as well. But let me give you a flavour for what it is that it says. So, what's been the inspiration for this piece? It comes down to what the real economic challenges are that the UK faces, and this is something that Centre for Cities obviously has looked at in great detail in recent years, particularly through the work we've done on levelling up. And one of the key things that we found, which is now something that is broadly accepted, at least as an approach, you can argue about whether it's actually been implemented or not, but as an approach, is that the big challenge that the UK faces is the underperformance of its largest cities outside of London. And when we've done some work on this, trying to measure what the size of that gap is, we find that actually it is large cities that are accounting for the vast majority or the largest portion of that underperformance. You can see here from this chart, we think that the underperformance of just these 8 large places, so Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, etc., it counts around about £48 billion, so £47 billion. So what that means is that the UK economy is around about roughly £47 billion smaller each year, because these places are punching well below their weight. Now, the big challenge with this is that, well, critics come back and say, well, if you're just focusing on big places, what about everywhere else? You can't just focus on these big places and think that everything is going to be fine elsewhere. And the biggest critics of this approach would then use the term trickle out. You're using trickle out economics here, which just focus on those big places, and everywhere else will just sort of benefit from the crumbs from that. And you then see this in terms of how we then see different places talked about. So in the media, for example, pull out this one article, Blythe, the town that levelling up forgot, a big piece on that. The idea that actually these places have been left behind, they're being forgotten by policy. What's policy doing for them? Something that's very emotive, and so that very much has captured the policy imagination probably over the last 8 or 9 years. And then we get politicians, doing this sort of thing as well. So very recently, back in June, when Rishi Sunak was given a speech, he said these words. He said, Labour's vision for the North is a narrow one. When Keir Starmer thinks of the North, he thinks only of big cities. My view of the North extends far beyond that. I want to stand for every part, want the party to stand for every part of the North, the towns, of the villages, as well as the great urban centres. And clearly this is something from a political perspective is quite tricky, because if you just are seen to be representing one place, that isn't how you win votes elsewhere. And clearly that's what Rishi Sunak is trying to put forward by this vision of, we care about all these other places too. I certainly could argue that I think the characterisation of Labour's position is a bit of a characterisation, but it's interesting, the political battleground that this shows, and it's reflective, I think, of what we've had in previous years. The big problem with this is that, both those types of analysis is that it treats every place as an isolated individual place, rather than understanding the relationships between. So this idea of trickle out, it's quite a pejorative term, borrowed from the idea of trickle down, which again is quite pejorative because it's been widely derided as not being true. It's sort of thinking that every place will stand up on its own, and that relationships between different places don't matter. So the purpose of this briefing is to actually understand that and say, well, does trickle out exist? Is it a thing? Are we right to think that we do need to focus on big cities and then actually bring broader benefits? Or is that connection just not there? And if big cities improve, actually everywhere else won't improve. And that clearly means that we need other interventions elsewhere. So, okay, well, let's investigate that. So what I'll do is I'll take you through now. We did this for looking at the example of just one city, Newcastle, but we did this for all 8 large cities in England. So places like Bristol, Newcastle, Liverpool, Leeds, etc. And you can see that in the briefing. But let me focus on just one place, Newcastle, so we can sort of illustrate this as simply as possible. What we did was to do 2 things. We said, right, well, let's look at income data. ONS now releases income data at really, really small geographies. So that allows us to look at towns, but also villages as well. We said, well, let's correlate that then against commuting into the big city. So can we see a relationship between those 2 variables in terms of incomes in a town or a village around a big city and commuting into that big city, which might tell us something about prosperity that is made available. And there are 2 things to pull from this. The first is that across all of the cities, we can see this in Newcastle as well, most towns and villages have higher average resident incomes than what the city dwellers themselves have. Now, that might actually seem as a bit of a surprise when we hear all this political narrative around left behind towns, the cities have had it too good, the big cities have had it too good, and all these towns are struggling. Actually, the majority of towns are doing better from a residential income perspective than what the big city is doing. So that really should give us pause for thought about that element of the narrative. The second one is that you can see in Newcastle's instance, of those towns that don't have, or villages that have very little commuting in Newcastle, they have very low average incomes as well. Whereas when you look at the relationship across the whole of the chart, you can see that it's broadly positive, that those places that have high levels of commuting into the big city also have higher average incomes, which start to tell us, actually, hang on, there's a relationship going on here, that prosperity that is created within the big city doesn't just stay within this big city, it's spread further out. Now, of course, correlation doesn't mean causation. But if we then look at that with other data from the ONS, which shows us that commuters are much more likely to take high-paid jobs than people who live within the city. And this is very much telling us a story about the role that these big places play in their wider regions. And so that means in a place like Newcastle, for example, or around Newcastle, places like Seahouses or Berwick, which are very much to the north of Northumberland, a very, very long way away, are isolated from that city and are unable to access the prosperity in the same way as if we then start looking at a place like Corbridge or Morpeth, which are much closer and are much more able not only to access the prosperity in that city, but actually the high-paid jobs in particular that exist within that city. So this relationship is really, really important. But there's something interesting here about if we then overlay Bristol onto Newcastle, we see two more interesting things. The first one is that the relationship is very, very similar. Positive relationship there. Those towns and villages that have high levels of commuting into that big city, be it Newcastle or Bristol, have higher average incomes. But the second one is about how much prosperity Bristol and Newcastle spread to their broader areas. So Bristol is interesting because it's the only one of the 8 big cities that really sort of performs about as we would expect. You know, it does well. All of the other cities in that category tend to underperform where they should be, particularly relative to their large European neighbours. And that's a big challenge. It's a big challenge not just for the city itself or for the national economy, as I showed in that first slide. You know, it sums to about £47 billion worth of underperformance. But it's a problem also for the places around these big places too. So Bristol and Newcastle are playing exactly the same role in their broader area, but Bristol is spreading a much greater amount of prosperity than what Newcastle does. And so the way to see this is that if we then, and you can see here in terms of the average incomes in Newcastle and Bristol, average incomes in Bristol are higher than in Newcastle. That's because Bristol does better, so stronger economy, its residents do well, but actually the residents of surrounding towns and villages perform very well as well. If you focus on that top right area of this chart, so what we've now highlighted in the square, and look at the towns that are there, in sort of how many of them that there are there. So we look at this by saying, right, well, how many towns and villages have commuting into the big city over 20%, and how many of them have average incomes of over £17,500? You can move those parameters if you like. The more important thing is, well, how many towns and villages fit into that box? And in Bristol, it's 18. So 18 towns and villages, and that counts around about 89,000 people who live in those places. In Newcastle, it's just 9. So half the number of settlements, and it's about 36,000 people who live in those towns and villages as well. So not only are there fewer places, but actually much fewer number of people living in those settlements too. And that's telling us actually the underperformance of Newcastle, while it spreads prosperity to the wider northeast area, this underperformance is harming those places around it because it's not generating as much prosperity as it should be. And therefore, there's not as much prosperity to access for people who both live within Newcastle, but actually live around Newcastle as well. So this relationship is very, very important. And it does tell what it tells us is that this idea of trickle out, actually the relationship is there. Calling it something pejorative is not helpful. It's not helpful to people who live around these places because it's a phenomenon that we see. And actually, trickle out is a bit of a mislabeling. It's more of a flood out when you look at the prosperity that is generated and then does spread out, particularly from Bristol's perspective. And the big challenge for the northeast, or indeed South Yorkshire, when you look at Sheffield or other big places too in other parts of the country, is that while these big cities are playing a particular role in their regional economies, they should be playing a much bigger role. And there should be a much greater amount of prosperity that spreads out. And part of the reason why places like Blythe, for example, don't do as well as what maybe we would like, is because there isn't as much opportunity available within nearby Newcastle as what that should be the case. But there's quite a lot of variation when we look across towns, even sort of within this broad relationship. It's clear it's not a 100% sort of positive relationship that we see between the two variables. So it's telling us that there are some other things going on. So what is the variation? What drives this variation? Well, there are three things that we identify. First one here is what this chart shows. And what we've done is from just looking at Newcastle now to looking at all towns and villages around the 8 cities that we look at. That's at least 679 towns and villages in terms of how it's measured. Actually, in reality, it's probably a little bit more, but it gives you a scale. And we're talking about 8 big places and around about 700 smaller places that are within its orbit. And we split that relationship, you can see here, is broadly positive in terms of higher skilled residents with higher skill, or towns that have a large share of higher skilled people and towns that actually don't have so many high skilled people living within them. And you can see there that actually towards the top of the chart, the places that do better are the ones that tend to have more highly skilled populations. And if we then split those out completely, you can see there the two patterns. And actually for places that are dominated by low skilled people, you don't really see much of a positive correlation. For the high skilled ones, that relationship is much stronger. What this tells us is that it isn't just about having the prosperity available. Actually, people have to have the skills to access that prosperity. So skills is really, really important in terms of outcomes for towns. Number two is that the amenity offer, or the quality of life offer, it's a very subjective term, the quality of life offer that towns and villages provide has a degree of determination about how prosperous those places are too. So the idea of this is that if the skills element focused on existing residents, looking at what the town village offers as a place to live becomes important for those people who've decided to say, well, do you know what? I don't want to live in the city anymore. I want to go and live outside, or I'm moving into an area when I want to live in a town or village, where am I going to live? And clearly, all these towns around big cities are in a degree of competition about how they're going to attract people or not. And then those people are going to think, well, what is the offer here? So what does the housing offer look like? What does crime look like? What are whole other range of basket of indicators that we might think are interesting, but we probably haven't got the data available to look at? What does it look like on that measure too? And that will affect about where people decide to live, particularly higher skilled people. And so what we do to try and measure that in this chart is we do the same analysis again, but we look at housing quality. So look at the share of houses that are in council tax bands A and B, which is the lowest banding, tend to be cheaper, low quality housing. Not perfect, but it gives you a very good measure. And again, you can see here, now this time the dark green dots, the places with fewer of these types of housing, better quality housing in them, tend to have better performance too. We're getting a degree of sorting going on here. And places that are seen to be nicer places to live, the ones that are more likely to be attracting in high skilled workers who then go to disproportionately access the prosperity that exists within a city. If we do this for crime too, we see a very, very similar pattern to give you a feeling of measures of this quality of life element. Then the third factor, which determines the outcomes for towns beyond the performance of the big city itself, is clearly transport. And we can see, within the Newcastle charts I was showing earlier, a lot of the places that had average incomes below the Newcastle average to the bottom left-hand corner of the chart, they are places that are fairly isolated. They are a long way away, and you're going to have to travel a long distance in order to get into the city to work. Places that are closer tend to have much higher levels of commuting into the big city. So clearly distance is important. Transport within that can try and cut down those travel times is an important factor in terms of what's going on. But I just want to sound an element of caution here, because in a lot of conversations that we have over the years, usually we hear that transport is the answer, what's the question? And it's seen as a little bit of a silver bullet to sort of solve all the problems of an area. And clearly, while it's got a role to play, we just need to be a little bit cautious on this. And so let me give you an example to illustrate why that's the case. So we pick out here two places, Tamworth and Lichfield, that are around Birmingham. Now, what's interesting, you can see on the far right-hand side, is that travel times into Birmingham from Tamworth are actually lower than what they are from Lichfield. So it's quicker to get into Birmingham from Tamworth than it is from Lichfield. So that's a tick in the box for Tamworth. Anybody looking to move out of Birmingham and move into a town or village, Tamworth has got the edge over Lichfield. And yet, when we then look at the first column and look at the shared residents that are commuting into into Birmingham from these two places, we can see actually it's higher in Lichfield, 22% v 17%. And if you look at incomes as well, we see that the outcomes for Lichfield are better in terms of that average income of the residents is higher than what it is for Tamworth. So why is that? What's going on there? Well, if you look at the share of residents with a degree, double the share of people in Lichfield have the skill levels of what they do in Tamworth. So they're actually better equipped to access what fairly limited opportunity there is in Birmingham, should be much larger. Then we look at the quality of housing. Quality, always have to be careful about that. Again, that's subjective. But look at the share of housing that's in council tax bands A and B. We can see in Tamworth it is double the share there than what there is in Lichfield, which probably tells us something about the nature of the housing stock, the nature of the living offer in Lichfield, which suggests that people are looking at transport, but looking at it as part of a broader basket of things need to take into consideration, and actually the things trump it, that people are doing a trade-off and going, do you know what? I'd rather have that slightly longer travel into Birmingham every day, or 2 or 3 days a week, as we seem to be in the position of at the moment, and then get all the benefits of the things I'm looking for, rather than just focusing on transport. And so the answer for Tamworth in part will be about, what do you do about skills of the residents that are there? What do you do about the housing offer in that place? What do you do about the other amenities that are available to make Tamworth a more attractive place to live for existing residents and potential future residents, while we also try and deal with the underperformance of Birmingham overall? So grow the size of the pie, then what we're doing about the towns around it to make sure they can access the extra prosperity that is generated. What does this then mean for policy? Well, we've got 5 main things to take away. The first one is that tackling the underperformance of big cities it isn't just for the benefit of the people living in those cities themselves, but it's for the broader area too. In that pejorative term, trickle out actually works. And I think, as I said earlier, much less of a trickle out, and actually much more of a flood out in terms of that prosperity that is generated. Number 2, skill levels influence how towns or residents in towns and villages can access that prosperity. Really important we do something about that. 3, their quality of life offer, so-called, is important in terms of their ability to attract in people and retain people. 4th, transport is important, but only in the context of 1, 2, and 3. Don't look at transport in isolation. And then 5, I think a much thornier issue is that clearly here we're looking at towns and villages that are within the orbit of big cities. And those ones that are much more isolated, like Berwick or like Sea Houses that we were talking about earlier, there's a much thornier question there about what policy can do, because the levers it can pull, economic levers it can pull, are fairly limited. Clearly distances are a big barrier there. So what do you do about those towns and villages? And the key thing there for policy is about then, well, what can we pull? What levers can we pull? We can pull levers around the quality of public services, and should we try to make those public services the best that we possibly can? Think about schools, think about GP surgeries, think about crime, etc. How to try and make those as good as we possibly can, because pulling those economic levers and bringing lots of opportunity to the doorstep is probably going to be fairly difficult, even though politically that is a hard thing to say. All of this is on our website. We have the briefing on there, which you can go and hopefully read in more detail. But also we have on the landing page some interactive data too. So you can look at all the data for all the cities, all the 8 cities that we look at and the 700 places around them. You can hover over them, find out what the names of the different places are and what their data looks like as well. So please do go and have a play with that. But on that note, Andrew, back to you.
Cheers, Paul. Thank you very much indeed. As Paul said, a lot more detail on the website, briefing and related materials, including a podcast. If you've got some questions that you want to put to Paul now, based on what he's said, or you're skimming of the briefing, then put them in. We've had a couple of questions, which we'll come to in a second. I suppose one of the claims, or one of the ambitions of the briefing, Paul, is your point you made right at the beginning, is to, we bang on about the scale and geography is quite important when you're thinking about how the economy or how economies function. One of the aspirations from the briefing is to try and not treat places in isolation, not to treat them as islands. And if you do something here, it has no benefit there. And actually thinking about the scale and the geography at which you do things is really quite important, which then influences policy. So hopefully the briefing helps make some of the arguments around that overall intention. We've had a couple of questions, Paul. One is about Birmingham. Obviously, we're talking today, and this morning information came out, obviously news came out that Birmingham had filed for a Section 114 notice, which effectively declares it kind of bankrupt, not quite, can't go bankrupt, but similar. So there's a big question about the funding and the underpinning funding of our cities, which is a big question beyond the briefing. Maybe we'll come back to that. But a more particular focused question from Colin Haylock. Paul, actually, you can talk a little bit about maybe Liverpool is the good example of this, although he references Manchester. But basically, Colin says, are the patterns very different for a trickle up between cities with a degree of polycentricity such as Manchester and those with nearby places that are more detached or separate market towns? I mean, talk about Manchester to a degree, but actually we highlight Liverpool as an interesting example that has a market town quite close to it. And it does seem to have an effect then on how the catchment area for Liverpool functions. Could you say a little bit about that, and then we'll take up some of the other questions as well? Yes,
this is a great question. And it was something that we thought long and hard about when we were trying to put the methodology together for the report, because there's a question, well, where do you draw the boundary about what is the catchment area that we are looking at around different places? And to some degree, it's sort of subjective, but it's influenced by the other economic centres that might be close to a place. So when we look at Newcastle, in particular to the north of Newcastle, where there's Northumberland, but there are no other big cities, you sort of get the purest effect in terms of this relationship between the big city and smaller places, because as you get further away, because there isn't another centre of economic gravity in place, that is a big challenge then for a place like Seahouses or Berwick towards the north of Northumberland. And you see they don't do very well. And you really see the role that these big places play in their wider area. Where that starts to get a little bit more difficult to pull out is when you have got other big centres in place. So, for Liverpool, for example, you've got Manchester not very far away, is the biggest, and clearly sort of placed between Liverpool and Manchester can look in both directions. But then you've also got other smaller places like Birkenhead, like Wigan, like Warrington, for example, that there's a degree of pulling around as well. But I think the most surprising thing for us for Liverpool was actually it wasn't just the pull of some of these larger places, but it was also the pull of Chester, which is smaller. Centre City doesn't look at Chester because it's outside the 63 largest places that we look at. And actually Chester to some degree seems to be I was going to say distorted, and that's not the right word, seems to be offsetting perhaps some of the underperformance that Liverpool has. And you then see a lot of those rich places, rich towns and villages in the north and west of Cheshire, which I think I personally always thought that that's where people who do high-skilled jobs in Liverpool go to live. Actually, that's not the case. They aren't very reliant on Liverpool. It's not 0%, but it's not very high reliance. And there's much greater pointing into Chester. So there's something quite interesting going on from what drives that in Chester, and do we learn anything from that or not? But what that then means to Liverpool is that you'll see when people look in the briefing or go on the interactive chart and select Liverpool relative to the other places, is that there are many fewer dots on the scatter plot for Liverpool than what is the case for other places. Because actually Liverpool's hinterland has shrunk, so much for two reasons. One is because you've got all these rival economic centres, but also because it underperforms. And so it's not offering as much prosperity as some of the other places are. And therefore you haven't got this large level of commuting in. So very few people commute in from North Cheshire, because actually the amount of prosperity that's available in Liverpool is smaller than what it should be. And so, phrase that another way, if we're trying to measure underperformance, I've shown you one, which is Newcastle and Bristol. Same relationship, same role going on, but many more places in that top right-hand corner. Another way of measuring that is actually from a Liverpool perspective, is that it just doesn't, the relationship holds, but only for a very, very small number of towns and villages around it. And as you go further out, actually, the places on the next step out for Liverpool are looking elsewhere, not looking into Liverpool. Now, you could say, well, does that matter? No, Chester's performing very well. That's all fine and dandy. And it's great that Chester does so well. But I think the issue is that why is Liverpool not contributing more to the relationships that we see in the Northwest? In the way that if you look at Bristol, for example, Bristol's got Bath very close by, strong performer in its own right, not unlike Chester in that respect. But Bristol still is generating all this extra prosperity, so that people living in Bath or living around Bath have the option of either we go and commute into Bath, or actually we go and commute into Bristol too. So very interesting patterns that are going on. from a Manchester perspective, that does play out to some degree as well, but its hinterland probably is broader than what we see in Liverpool. And the most marked element of this is certainly within Liverpool or around Liverpool.
Great. Thank you, Paul. It just shows, even within a sample of 8, that there's different stories and aspects, even if there are themes and threads that are really quite important, and reinforces, I think, just the nature of Paul's response, reinforces that thinking about these places, how they operate together and rather than separately is really quite important. A couple of just very specific questions, Paul. We've got one, have you explored the census 2021? I imagine travel patterns would be quite different post-COVID. I don't think they are, but you can say something on that. And then related again from anonymous attendee, how has all this been affected by the shift towards home working for higher skilled jobs post-COVID? 2 big questions we get asked consistently. Yeah. One is technical and one is slightly less. Answer them both.
So you've both got a common theme in that the most recent commuting data, what would it show? So the first thing to say is that we use the 2011 commuting data because it's the most recent available. They haven't even released, the ONS hasn't even released the 2021 census data yet. So even if it was available, even if we wanted to use it, we can't because it hasn't been released yet. So we're using the latest available data. The second question then is, well, will that 2021 data actually tell us anything that's interesting? Well, given that the census was run during a lockdown, I think the answer to that sadly is going to be no. And that's certainly why we think we need to rerun the census in 2026. We have precedents for that. We did it in the 60s. We should do it again, have a sort of mid-decade census. Or we find other ways to try to measure these sorts of things, but especially at the fine-grained detail that we're able to do within the census, and certainly from the 2011 data, the very small geographies that we're using here. Now, we're talking about towns and villages, and getting at that level of detail can, at the moment, only be provided by a census. But if we were, let's say we were to run the census tomorrow and we would look at commuting patterns, do we think these things would be altered? And I think, as you were suggesting, Andrew, we don't think that will be the case. Because what we've seen is that the shifts in working patterns over the last few years have gone from mainly office-based to being almost exclusively at home when lockdowns were in place, to moving much more back towards a hybrid pattern. And so even if people aren't going in 5 days a week, they are still accessing the high-paid job that exists within disproportionately accessing the high-paid job that exists within the city, 2 or 3 days a week, then doing the rest of that work at home. So we would still very much expect that these patterns would play out in spite of what's happened and the changes that the pandemic have had to date. Where we've settled on currently, we think the patterns will still hold. Yeah, it's a great point. I would just add a couple of things on that. When we look at the data, as Paul showed already, lots of high-skilled workers are already living outside of the city currently or before the pandemic. And so therefore you don't get a boost from them. And when we've looked at the data provided by Rightmove and others, if you were high skilled and living in cities and you typically moved into the hinterlands where other high skilled workers were already. So there's a kind of, if anything, the big picture is, if you believe that there's been quite substantive changes, the relationships between towns, villages and cities has been strengthened in post-COVID because of the nature of relationships rather than not. So that would be a big picture, quick response on that, which I think is interesting. Just to come back to DW's question, he asked the first one, which is basically, look at the Birmingham situation. Many of our cities are skint. That must have an effect. I mean, Paul can come in on that. Again, my very quick and superficial response is, yeah, it obviously does have an effect. DW, I would say there's 2 things to think about. One is the level of funding that our cities have received, and we and others have done work which shows over the last decade or a bit longer that our urban areas have suffered disproportionately relative to non-urban local authorities in terms of funding cuts. So there's a level question, just where funding is in many of our cities now, and that's a central government issue, I think, as much as it is a local issue, and we should be mindful about that. And then secondly, I think there's an underlying problem or challenge about the type of funding and the way that places get their money, and they are still reliant directly and indirectly on central government for that, either because they set the rules or because they literally get the money through some kind of grant transfer.
both of those things compound some of these issues in some respects, because they make places reliant on central government and the decisions they make, and don't give them the opportunities to think about how they might grow their economy and therefore benefit financially from that, which is a long and complicated answer. But I think type of funding as well as level of funding is quite important to think about. But undoubtedly some of our urban areas, as the news this morning has shown us, are struggling just to provide some of the basics. So I don't know if you want to add anything into that, Paul.
Yeah, and we'll have a report out on this very nature of the things that you talked about there, Andrew, in a couple of weeks' time. So everyone should watch this space for that. In terms of how it plays out, I think for the particular thing that we're looking at today, I mean, if we think that the role the council plays and the money it gets, a lot of it is spent on provision of public services. That's going to play into the attractiveness of Birmingham as a place to live. And if particularly high skilled people think, actually, the provision of services here is not as good as what it is maybe outside of Birmingham in some of those towns and villages that we've been talking about, then perhaps some of that starts to influence the balance of where people choose to live. Having said that, from an economy perspective, I mean, notwithstanding the ability of the council to deliver regeneration projects, which in part will be about Birmingham City Council, but actually part of it would be the West Midlands Combined Authority and the Mayor, so they're separate from this. From an economy perspective, as long as Birmingham continues to be an attractive place to invest, you would expect the private sector to be coming in, or you want the private sector to be coming in, generating that prosperity, and that spreads that prosperity over a broader distance. And the functioning of the council, strictly speaking, shouldn't affect the relationships that we see beyond the sorting of people that it might influence around sort of the broader Birmingham area.
Great, excellent. I just don't know, John Carr, I'm not ignoring your comments as much as your questions. I kind of agree with them. I'm trying to figure out how we kind of might weave them into the conversation. Your point about the role of transport, as Paul said, it is important both in terms of explaining to a degree the patterns that we see, but also where we would want to get to. I think the point that we would make and Paul was making is that it's not the be all and end all, and I think that's my vote. Notwithstanding, as you rightly say, there are environmental reasons, there are equity reasons that you might also want to improve public transport, which is why one of the reasons we're big fans of things like buses and others, because there are air quality plus environmental plus equity benefits that accrue from improving public transport over and above overly reliant on the car. Two questions, Paul. Take this one because this is the obvious one. Took a while, a bit longer than I actually thought, but there we go. Anonymous attendee, been busy. Does this trickle out purely lead to gentrification and price out local people in towns? And isn't it also a lottery if your town is pretty enough for people to want to move out to? So, you benefit or you don't, but if you do benefit, you get priced out. Thoughts on that? Yeah,
I mean, that's all. A lot of that. Well, some of it comes down to history, and there isn't a great deal we can do about that in terms of the very narrow folk element of that, about beautiful Georgian stock or whatever it might be, where we do see a place like Morpeth, I think I might have highlighted earlier, around Newcastle. Clearly, it's got, well, for those of you who know it, will know that it's a very pretty place, and clearly that's going to have the edge over a place like Blyth in terms of attracting people in. Now, we're not proposing to get in a time machine and go back and change that. Clearly, that's something that is set. But there is a broader sort of decision making or influence that policy has got around that. So are people going to be priced out? Well, that depends on whether we decide to build enough homes in these places. If they're attractive places to live, then why are we not increasing the supply of housing in them to try and moderate any house price increases? If we think that amenity value is important, then why are we not building the types of homes that people would be attracted to? Clearly, old homes have a particular attraction to perhaps people of certain demographics certain areas of the income distribution, higher end. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't then create new houses that would also be attractive too. There are choices around that we are able, from a policy perspective, to influence that we should be thinking about. So it's reflecting on all those types of things, as well as I think there's a broader interested element here, which is not now. The narrative of the last couple of years has been, oh well, the big cities get everything and all the towns get left behind. Now, actually, the nature of that question is, well, hang on a minute, like this prospect is being generated, and we have this gentrification coming, and that's awful. And so we can't have it both ways. In the same way that I think some of the conversations we've picked up when we've been talking about this locally too, as being, oh, well, the towns are getting, and the villages are getting all the benefits from the big city, and all the people in the cities are actually benefiting from the prosperity in the city, and that's really bad. So hang on, that's the opposite. 2 years ago, we were arguing about how these towns weren't benefiting, and now we're saying, oh, it's really bad that those towns are benefiting because the people in the cities aren't benefiting. And I think it's this black and white element of it's one or the other, and not understand the relationships between the two that gets us into these positions, when really we should be saying the challenge for a lot of these big places is that they're not generating enough prosperity. Bristol does. That pulls up prosperity for residents living within Bristol. We could do more around that, but it does pull up prosperity for residents within, but also around too. And that's the key thing that we need to think about. Then you have a series of policy choices about how towns and villages around those big places then do access that prosperity, to do with skills, to do with amenity offer, which includes houses, to do with, to a degree, transport, etc. Yeah,
a good point. Question from Adam Bars, Paul. He sort of links it to the Anna Stansbury's piece with Ed Balls and Dan Turner, which we looked at. We had Anna on a podcast a couple of months ago talking about the paper and its implication, to look at whether we were able to, or would we be able to, differentiate in terms of that higher skilled element between degrees, STEM and non-STEM, given that the premiums seem to be higher across the piece for STEM-related activity, even in places outside of the Greater South East, when the wage premium for overall graduates seems to be reducing, if not next to a minimum. But do you want to answer that?
I wish we could. Unfortunately, the census doesn't go into that level of detail. The census goes into loads of detail across a range of different things, which is why the census is so important. But it doesn't give that level of breakdown. Now, the data in principle exists. Anna accessed that data on the types of degree or the types of qualification from the labour force survey. The labour force survey is only a sample, and so if you aggregate the big areas, it does the job. If you look at the geographies we're looking here, which are very, very small, small towns and villages, we just don't have that data available, which is very frustrating.
Yes. How many times have we said that? Probably about 5 times today, and just ditto that across every other day. Okay, John, come back in again. Thank you, John. And it actually connects to a question that Jeff Austin put in as well. Be interesting on your thoughts on this, Paul. It's really about, I suppose, the capability or the capacity of the city region administrations, or the institutional capabilities. I think 2 things on that. One, does the institutional capability or decisions made by those institutions influence what we've seen, the analysis that we've done, and to what extent do we think it might influence what we might want to do about it? Which again, I think is an interesting sort of reflection, really, in terms of, is it that Bristol does better and we've seen that its administration is more entrepreneurial, more dynamic, more capable than Newcastle's administration, that maybe hasn't done, that city doesn't do as well as Bristol? How much explanatory force is the institution playing? What are your thoughts on that?
So in terms of the difference in the economic performance of places across the UK, I don't think that the institutional arrangements we've had in recent decades do explain a great deal of what's gone on. I think the reason why Bristol does so well is because it inherently offers a number of advantages around access to lots of skilled workers in particular. That has made it a very attractive place to come and do business for high skilled businesses. They've come in, they've created those jobs, and that's then generated prosperity for a broader area. Why Bristol managed to have a higher number of high skilled people than elsewhere, we don't actually know the answer to that, because we haven't got the data available to be able to understand at which point did that change and why did that change come about. And there'll be all sorts of history and legacy things that are probably involved in that. There's a broader question which touches on what you were saying earlier, Andrew, about the work we're doing around incentives and how we fund local government, which is that across the board, local government in the UK is incredibly underpowered in terms of being able to have any influence over changing these sorts of things. And we think that's a bad thing. We think we should be a great amount of power at the local level to try and tackle the big challenges that different places face, and try and increase the amount of prosperity that is available. And we think the system should be set up in such a way to incentivise that too. So in terms of the difference we see between places, I wouldn't say that institutional capacity has probably been a factor in why we observe what we observe today. But I do think that the underperformance of the majority of the big cities that we do see is in part, not all, but is in part because of the underpowered, fragmented nature of local government in the UK, which means that the policies that have been applied in those places to try and improve their performance has been pretty blunt. I think part of the thing that we would want to see in the policy response is that we do want to see a great degree of devolution and strengthening of capacity building, institution building, and deepening of the powers that they have, so they do have more control at the local level to try and improve their performance. That won't change everything, but we do think it will have a positive difference.
Yeah, that's great. So we're getting towards the end, but Colin Haylock will put the Manchester polycentricity question, come back in on a similar theme. Boys, is there any evidence that any combined authorities are actually planning to maximise trickle-out effects? That's a great question, Colin. I think, let me go first on this. I think they increasingly recognise and appreciate the obvious point that, when you look at those big combined authority areas, there are different places within them and they are different. And I think, you hear the politicians particularly talking about that, whether you're in the West Yorks or South Yorks or wherever it might be, they'll talk about that. I think where there's slightly still an underappreciated or underdeveloped approach is what does that mean then for policy, and particularly, what's the relationship between different places on the one hand, but how do investments of different types in different bits of your area, how do they both directly benefit the place you're investing in, but how do they also provide benefits that go well beyond your particular jurisdiction? And I think there's a bit of a disconnect between a sort of recognition that there are villages and towns and cities in my patch, but actually when you start to think about policy prioritization, it then ignores all of that and treats everywhere exactly the same again, and you start to get into it's £5 for this place and £5 for that place, and if we're doing something like that here, we have to do something like that everywhere else. So that would be my again my kind of initial reaction. I don't add to anything to that.
Yeah, different places play different roles in the national economy when you look at places across the country. But when you get even into a combined authority area, different places within the combined authority play different roles. And the city centre will be playing a particular role, generating a disproportionate amount of prosperity for broader areas, whereas the suburbs are playing an opposite role, which is the suburbs are supplying the key inputs to businesses, which is workers, and hopefully in successful places at least skilled workers. So it is about understanding. We can't say devolve, but then because everywhere is different, but then have a flat earth policy when we get to the combined authority level. The combined authorities do need to recognise that we should be expecting different places to be playing different roles, and how does policy then support them? And I think it varies across combined authorities in terms of how much that is recognised. Now, clearly, there's a small p political issue with that, which might mean they say one thing externally, but do something differently internally. But clearly, that's not clear to pick up from when we look from the outside. I think they do need to be clear about that. The town centre of one place in the combined authority is going to do something different than the city centre, which is something different than the village or the town fringe. Yep. The second element of that is clearly the combined authorities cover the urban areas, but they don't tend to, not always, but don't tend to spill beyond that urban area. But their relationship they've got with the county beyond and the rural areas beyond is very, very important. And a big pitch for them is that, look, we provide a great deal of prosperity for these places, but also the pitch from the county is that we provide a key input in terms of skilled workers. And again, that relationship is important to understand, not just about what's going on within the combined authority, but also around it too. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, 12:45. So we need to finish. As we said, and we've said several times, the briefing's on the website along with blogs and podcasts. You can get all of that. I hope you've enjoyed it. We've answered most of your questions to the extent that we can. If you're interested, this time next week, we'll be talking about our new report, which is looking at the geography of new economy and innovative hotspots across the country and the relevance of that to the government's investment zones policies. So come back this time next week and we'll have a related but slightly different conversation about innovation, hotspots, economy clusters, and investment zones. So until then, take care and stay safe. Thanks, Paul. Take care, everybody. Bye for now.